Hello.
Hello.
So, I thought today we'd talk about confidence
Oh, okay.
as a concept and how that plays with
Yeah, I like that.
dynamics
I
with
like that.
relationships,
Hmm.
all forms of relationships, and
Yeah,
obviously
yeah,
working environment.
yeah.
Um, as you know, I'm supremely confident.
I do.
Bullshit. Um, Actually, I am in certain areas
Yeah.
and just not in others, and everyone's the same. I don't think there's like a total confidence number that people
Mm.
have.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm supremely confident in everything I do. I think everyone has areas where they're not. But what would be interesting is to talk about how that plays out and how that affects people's behaviour,
Sure.
and how they then show up in different environments
No,
and
I
situations.
think that's a great topic. And for me, at any rate, you've already broken one stereotype. Um,
Really,
yeah,
what was
and
that?
that is, well, you admitted as a male, you admitted to having areas of life where you don't feel confident, and uh, I've got personal experience of, well, let me give you an example. So, about 4 years, 5 years ago now, I ran a series of workshops in London, and I advertised them on Facebook, and it was called the Total Confidence Workshop.
Mm.
Actually, no, it's called the Total Confidence Framework, I think. And so I advertised them on Facebook. I had some help from a guy who was a marketing expert on Facebook. So he was helping me to like word all the adverts and the posts and everything that went to promote it. And I had quite a good response. And I hired this room in a hotel in London. And here's the results, right? Because these results have stayed with me. Now, bearing in mind that this was a male marketing guy that helped me,
Yeah.
I hope you think I'm male. Um, so yeah, we're sort of approaching this from a male perspective.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, 98% of the respondents to the advertising, and there was a significant number of respondents. So it's not like it was like two respondents.
Mm.
This was it was statistically significant number of respondents. 98%, sorry, 95% of the people who responded to the advertising were female.
Yeah.
And of the people that responded and said they were coming to the workshop, 98%
What
were
women?
women. Yeah. Only 2% of men who attended the workshops. And I ran four over 4 months
Yeah.
were men.
So
So
why do you
you've
think
just,
that is?
well, I think that there is a hardwired sociological uh, issue for men to admit they're not confident. It's like if a man admits that he's not confident, it's almost like he can't play out the male role.
Yeah.
Um, and I bumped up against this. Um, it was just after actually it was the day I was made redundant for the second time, which was April 2012. And so um, I got the call and I was told I was being let go. I
Mm.
was commercial director at the time, so it was quite a senior role. And I was separated from the ex. I had like massive bills, and it was like, oh my
Mm.
god, what am I going to do? And I had an I set up. I was able to set up very quickly a meeting with somebody I knew who was like a headhunter type person to try and get me on the track of getting another job. And so I went to meet with her that evening,
Mm.
and we had a chat. And she said to me, it seems to me like you've just completely lost your confidence. And I remember saying to her, no, no, look, it's not about my confidence. I just need another job. Get me another job. I'll be
Yeah.
absolutely fine. And as I was driving back, something hit me. I mean, it was literally the feeling like I'd been hit by a Mike Tyson right hook.
Mm.
And it was not that I'd lost my confidence, that actually the reality was I'd never truly been confident.
Oh wow. Okay.
And
Yeah.
that was like, oh my God, that was a real wow moment.
Mm.
In fact, it was like a transformational moment because I got back that night and really started to think about that as an issue.
Yeah.
So, no, I think confidence is a hugely important um, area, and it's an area that a lot of people will not talk about openly. So
Yeah.
have you had any experience of that in any of the sort of
Yeah,
examples?
yeah, absolutely. What with clients, you mean, and
Yeah, yeah,
businesses
yeah,
that I've worked with? Yeah, of course. Yeah, there's been confidence where confidence has been a barrier to people doing the job that they're employed to do, and and that's been a difficult hurdle, I think, to overcome. I think the one that springs to mind immediately is in sales.
hmm
I worked on the board years ago of a sort of large PLC, and they had a sales team that weren't performing, um, or weren't performing in the way that they needed to. The business needed them to, so there was a bit of a sort of an alignment issue. And then when you got under the skin of it, they were literally scared and lacking confidence to pick the phone up and have a
yeah,
conversation,
yeah,
and sort of trying to unravel some of that in terms of why that was the case, what had happened to cause that.
mm,
This was a business that sort of operated with lead generation tools, if you like, or
yeah, yeah,
bought a vast amount of data in. And they'd changed that and toyed with it. And obviously some of that data was low hanging fruit. Some of that data was quite hard to, work towards, and needed a lot of thought and, strategic thinking around how you crack the nut of the opportunity.
yeah,
And so their confidence had just waned as a consequence, and
mm.
they were on the floor. And so they were just, disengaged, but every time you spoke to them, oh yeah, well, everything's fine, and I've
Yeah,
got all this stuff in the pipeline, and it's
yeah,
going to come good.
yeah, yeah,
But actually it was all,
well,
fictitious, really.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
they were in a rut, and they didn't know how to get out of it, and they didn't know how to ask for help either.
mm,
Actually, thinking about it, it was far more difficult
hmm
for the male in that team
yeah,
to actually say, you're right, I've got an issue here.
yeah, yeah. So when I had this sort of epiphany moment, I could then sort of backtrack over my corporate career to all those moments where I had an issue which I had no idea how to handle, but because I actually didn't have the authentic confidence to go and ask for help,
Yeah.
I ended up somehow like wriggling my way through in a very non effective and efficient way. It's sort of somehow coming through the other side, but not really having any sense of how to handle that situation in a way that felt good, that felt like I had some sense of control. I always felt like all the events were controlling me and I had no power, and all of that sort of stuff. And but the thing was, I had actually become really quite successful. So I was quite senior. I reached, director level in 2 businesses, big businesses. I had massive responsibilities, but yet actually what underpinned it was not much at all. It was, other people obviously seeing that I could do a reasonable job, but when there were difficulties, it was like that confidence to actually open up and really reveal that vulnerability. I just didn't feel that. So yeah. And of course, once you then see it in yourself, you start to see it in other people.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely.
So I like talking about this subject because I think there's a lot of men who actually have this sense of not being confident, and women. But actually they don't know what to do about it. They don't know how to address it. So I think the fact that we're talking about this now is actually quite important. So what are some of the things? So you talked about how not being confident manifested itself in the sales team. Have you got any other examples of how a lack of confidence shows up with, say, a business owner or business leaders, or other things that you do in the workplace?
Yeah, I think having sort of in a consulting capacity, then I've seen that with people leading teams and unsure of the effect or the impact they're having. They start second guessing their approach. They start second guessing the results and the cause of those results. And it's quite easy for, I think, people to spiral actually in those sort of environments, because they start then attributing everything to reasons that perhaps aren't quite the real situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've seen it numerous times, you know, you get a bad result or you get a result that's unexpected. You know, normally it happens when, you know, I've seen it with a business where they had a lifelong client, and that
Yeah.
client suddenly went somewhere else,
Yeah.
and the confidence in the business went, and it went at the top,
Right.
all the way down, and then there was,
Yeah.
you know, everyone's on the back foot. So it was a, you know, I think it, it's an easy thing to have knocked,
Mm-hmm.
I think,
Yeah.
because it's a bit like it's kind of similar to that space of trust, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
kind of
Very.
another expression of trust, you know, trust
Yes.
in yourself and faith
Yes.
in yourself. And so
Absolutely.
it's quite fragile, I
Mm.
think, and can be knocked if there's things that, you know, particularly if they resonate with specific fears you've got, or
Yeah.
insecurities. And so and it has a ripple effect. It has a knock-on effect to, you know, other aspects of the business, other aspects of the responsibilities that they've got.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, then that, you know, the dynamic is, like you've said earlier, is you've got this dynamic where inside they're lacking confidence, they don't know what to do, they're in unknown territory, they're feeling wounded,
Yeah.
but on the flip side of that, they feel like they've got to project this personality of having all the answers, being
Yeah.
absolutely certain, absolutely assured.
Yeah.
And it's an impossible situation. And of course, if people are lacking confidence, it is easy to pick up. You know, for others on the
Oh,
outside, they see straight through it. It's not something
yeah.
you can hide very
You
effectively.
can't. And it's it's all that emotional leakage. It comes out. And
It comes out in other ways, doesn't it?
it does, absolutely. So yeah, you were talking about confidence sort of being a parallel with trust, and the thing that I always think about trust is, you know, trust takes a long time to build, but it takes an instant to break, you know.
Yeah.
And once you've broken trust with someone, it's actually quite difficult to get it back. And I think confidence is similar to that. You know,
it's a feeling, isn't it?
Yeah, and once you've lost that feeling, getting it back can be quite difficult, because you've got to overcome all the things in your mind that caused that sense of confidence to become broken, if it was ever there, really, you know.
Yeah, because it can be a bit like a house of cards.
Yeah. And so I think for a lot of people, what actually happens is not that their true, authentic confidence gets broken, it's their illusion of confidence that gets broken. And that's when you're in a really bad place, because then you've got nothing that you can hold on to. You know, it's like, you know, that was like the Zimmer frame, if you like, that was holding people up. And when that gets taken away, bang, they can be in a really bad place. And the truth is, that's what happened to me. You know, when I had that illusion of confidence pulled away from me, through various things that happened. So, you know, being made redundant for the second time was a big one. The collapse of the marriage was something else. And there was like a couple of other things all happening at the same time. Bang, I had nothing, and I was on the floor. You know, a lot of what I did, excuse me. Oh, thank you. Well, we won't cut that bit out. I've got the confidence to leave that in. You see, in the past, I would have cut that out, as it's like, you know, a human frailty to sneeze live on air.
Yeah, and you've got all that stuff around this sort of, you know, this sort of striving for perfection and invulnerability. And
exactly.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. But how does that all link to things? I mean, obviously, there's like a more recent description that sort of touches on this, which is this imposter syndrome. This notion of imposter syndrome. So how does that link to confidence, do you think, and this, you know, this underlying feeling that you're somewhere where you perhaps don't deserve to be, or you know, aren't
well, it's absolutely connected. And so imposter syndrome is really the description of that person who's reached a level of whatever you want to call it, seniority, status, authority, but actually in themselves, they don't believe they deserve to be there. And that's exactly what imposter syndrome is. But it's a purely internally driven thing, because, and this is what I didn't understand until after the event. It was like, you know, I could remember being in my 22nd floor glass walled office at Canary Wharf, in the corner, you know, looking out over London. It was just the most amazing view, and thinking, how did I get here?
Yeah.
You know, and it's like really not believing I deserved to be there. And because I didn't have that sense of that I deserved to be there, but that was the betrayal of my thinking, if you like, that
Yeah.
I was in this imposter place. And of course, that manifested in a lot of my behaviors when I reached that level of seniority. And you may be familiar with that well-known phrase, you know, people rise to the level of their incompetence. Yeah. There's I can't remember the name of the law now. There's a name for it. The guy who thought it up, it'll come. And I think there's a truth to that. But what got me frustrated was, so I saw people rising to the level of their incompetence in the roles that I had. And what I then saw was that the organization sort of really saying, okay, they've reached that level, we can't use them anymore, get rid of them.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, I worked in some pretty macho environments. Yeah. So, you know, I saw that happening. And of course, ultimately that happened to me. And the thing that frustrated me was there was no sense of, well, hang on a minute, there's more to this person than actually what they're showing. You know, it's like, they've got the potential to get through this if we can help them, and if we are willing to give them support, if we're willing to invest in them.
Yeah.
And you know, I was in the newspaper industry, so you know, those are industries which are massively dependent on machinery.
Yeah.
Of all types, you know, from like high level IT right through to the presses and, you know, the machines that, you know, the lorries that deliver the papers. And I always made the analogy that every business that's dependent on that sort of machinery has a budget for the maintenance and the upgrading of that machinery.
Yeah.
But it's like,
and they have people in situ as well, normally, that's their sole job, is to look after and maintain.
Exactly. But when it comes to people, most businesses actually don't have that. Not to that level. They'll have it to a degree. I mean, they'll have maybe, you know, a lot of businesses now have a training budget, but they don't really think of it, or they don't really think of their people as assets that have to be looked after and developed in the way they do about their you know, what from an accountancy perspective would be called capital assets, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so that was always the frustration I had. And of course, that way of thinking at the corporate level feeds into the insecurities which undermine confidence.
Yeah.
And that's why people are willing to show their weakness, because if they feel that if they show their weakness, they'll then start to be seen as having reached that level of incompetence. And that's the point at which most, you know, they have the experience that that's where most careers end at that point. And so I think corporations in particular lose a lot of talent and a lot of experience because they don't really have an approach and an understanding of how to help people get through these confidence crises. It's like, okay, bang, done, you're finished, out, get someone else who can do it, you know. And there are some industries where that is just completely ruthless, you know, and you know, you can think of some, like particularly in the financial markets and banking and all that sort of stuff, you know. So I think imposter syndrome is absolutely huge in this. It's a complete descriptor of what happens when you lose confidence. So from, you know, thinking about this, we sort of talked a bit about how it shows up a little bit, but I think there's an area which we haven't talked about in terms of how it shows up, and that's directly on people's behavior in the workplace. So this, you know, you could say I'm being a bit stereotypical here, and I would accept that, but I'd really love to know what you think about this. One of the ways in which I see particularly men who lack true confidence behaving in the workplace is becoming over macho and over aggressive.
Yeah.
as a compensation.
Yeah. And that happens a lot. People have then adopt one style of management, can't call it leadership,
Yeah.
but it's one style. And that's, it's interesting actually, because that's brought up, and I know this is stereotypical, but there is I know you're a big fan of Patrick Lencioni and some of his work.
Yeah.
But he's got this sort of framework which is around 5 temptations of a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And at the top of that tree is invulnerability over trust.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that comes from, is this I need to be impervious, I need to be, and they do overcompensate, they do become too aggressive. And if you look at, you know, even if you look at, even if you don't subscribe to it, someone like Goleman's sort of leadership styles, you know, so sometimes there is a place for that.
Yeah.
But people just live in that space, create an awfully toxic environment. And it is just a role that they feel they have to assume. It's a hat they put on, to compensate for the fact that, you know, something's not right under that hat.
Yeah. So I absolutely relate to that, because I can think back, you know, particularly to the first big job I had in newspapers, and I absolutely felt I had to be invulnerable, not just professionally but at home as well, you know. And it was, you know, when it infects your personal life, that's a very difficult place to be, because actually it's when you show your vulnerability that you actually, that's when you show your humanity. You know, because as individuals, as people, as human beings, you know, it's our vulnerabilities. We have vulnerabilities, you know. It's like,
we all do.
So if you try and hide them, everybody knows you're trying to hide them, and you cease to be a real person at that point. And it becomes obvious to everybody. And so, you know, this is all part of my journey towards self-awareness that, you know, kicked off 10, 12 years ago when things started to crumble. But the person that I've found who really has become probably the world's leading expert on this, and I know you'll know her name, is Brené Brown. So she's really the one who brought in vulnerability and made it something acceptable to talk about. And so she's got a TED Talk, which is one of the top viewed TED Talks. It's got tens of millions of views around the world, and, you know, she's hugely in demand now in all sorts of ways. And I think her work is incredibly important for anybody, man, woman, you name it, you know, who has any sort of leadership role, and who in any way feels that the level of, you know, the responsibilities they've got are too much for them. They don't know what to do. They're feeling overwhelmed. They're feeling stressed, whichever words you want to put on it. Having a look at some of Brené Brown's work and some of her advice that she gives on how to handle that sort of stuff, by allowing that sense of vulnerability, I think is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, definitely. And she looks at the difference between things like guilt and shame, doesn't she? And you know, how that then can be quite toxic in terms of, you know, I remember she talks about sort of guilt as a way to build integrity and learn, and shame is like an internal toxic view. So Brené Brown's definitely one worth looking into there. Absolutely.
So just picking up on what you've just said there, guilt and shame, of course, when you've got leaders who don't have that authentic confidence, they are the two triggers that they lean on to manipulate people to do the things they want. They guilt them and they shame them very often in public. So when I was talking about toxic behaviors, you were talking about toxic behaviors. When you've got leaders who lack authentic confidence, those are two of the things that they tend to play on to get people to do the things they want.
Well, I don't think it's just to get people to do the things that they want. I think it's also to get the feeling that gives them, the feeling of being in control and being over someone.
Yeah, wow, that's a big one. Yeah,
to actually compensate the fact that they're feeling small.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a double-edged sword. You know, there is this element of getting people to do what they need them to do or want them to do, but also it's the hit that gives them. And then, of course, that's quite addictive as well. So they think,
Yeah.
well, actually, that felt good for me to do
Yeah.
that because I'm feeling low, and I made someone else feel low, and
Yeah.
lower than me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, that's an awful environment, but it happens, and then
Well,
people,
it does.
you know, it becomes almost like a prop or a crutch
Yeah.
for them, you know, to get through a period where they haven't got confidence. Of course, they're not addressing the issue, they're not addressing the core of it, and you know, it
Yeah.
creates a different culture. That's when you get people leave, and all of
Yeah.
this stuff can
Yeah.
spiral out of control.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because of a lack of confidence somewhere in the business that's influential.
Yeah. 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 Well, that's the race to the bottom, isn't it? You know, and
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I'm sitting here feeling I don't know what the word is actually. It's somewhere in that sort of guilt shame space because it's taking me back to those, I'm going to call them my ignorant days in the corporate world, because I didn't know any of this stuff. So I was and I've talked about this before when we've been chatting, how I was behaving and acting in the way that I learned from the people that I was working with and for. You know, it was like that was the culture in that business, and I sucked it up like a sponge. You know, I thought, okay, if that's what you got to do to be successful, that's what I'll do. And I did it, and I was successful. So that became a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy and a very narrow perspective of my success.
Yeah.
And this is why I say that out of that ignorance, although I thought I was doing the right thing, I ended up hurting people, and that sits with me very strongly to this day. And it's part of why I do what I do today, is like a bit of a atonement for that. You know, it's you know, wanting to make things better. And so, you know, when we think about confidence, if we flip it on its head now and say, okay, if that's what a lack of confidence looks like, what does authentic confidence look like? How does it, how do you know when you're dealing and you're with somebody who is authentically confident?
Interesting, isn't it, actually? So I'm thinking this through. I think actually being authentic is the primary thing here. And actually, if there is an absence of confidence, just being honest about that and open about it. Because we're not all confident in all areas, and there isn't this notion of perfect confidence, or you know, we've not all experienced every scenario under the sun. But I think if you approach it in an authentic way that is your true self, then I think actually that's the better thing to strive for than trying to create confidence. I think the confidence will come after that. It's not, as I say, it's a feeling. It's not something you can. I can't turn around and say to someone, right, be confident.
No.
Any more than I could say someone, trust me. You know, if they don't know me, they're not going to trust me.
Sure.
And if they're not confident, they're not going to feel confident. So I think the real focus for me is to just work on being authentic, and the confidence, and have faith that the confidence will come as a consequence of that, and bring people in. Don't push people away. You know.
Yeah. Can I play the? I don't like this term, but I don't know another one. The devil's advocate on this, because, like, if I was working in one of the like high macho cultures of finance or, you know, stock trading, whatever it might be, you know, for one of those firms in the city, or it could be a law firm, you know, it could be like one of the big consulting firms. There's any number of, well, not any number, there's quite a few industries where that sort of macho culture exists. Listening to what you've just said, I would go, that's bull. You know, it's like, there's no way that I could do what you're suggesting and hold on to my job, because if I was to reveal that to the people who make the decisions, they'd just say, I'm not up for the, you know, I'm not of the caliber that they need. So I mean, how can people trapped in that sort of position deal with it?
Well, deal with an absence of confidence. How they overcome it and become confident, if you like.
Well, how can they deal with that sense? Because, you know, I think this is a real thing, because
it is.
I've known people who worked in that industry and turned to drink,
Yeah.
Who had to get out because they couldn't deal with it, whose relationships failed because they couldn't separate work and home. And that's something that I very much relate to. So, you know, I've seen this where there's a lack of confidence in an organization that is not empathetic, is not caring, and just sees people as a number on a spreadsheet. How do you, you know, what can you do if that's you? You know, how do you break it? How do you break the spiral?
I don't know. I mean, for me, I'd be sitting there questioning whether that's the right environment for me.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, there's this old sort of saying of ignorance is bliss. I'd be sitting there thinking, am I right? Am I the right fit for this environment, for this industry, for this line of work? Not condoning that line of work, but what we're talking about is transformational, like massive culture change for industry or a business. And so that's an appetite that sits with the business, not necessarily with the individual. So I struggle with that, actually, because I think, well, I think you need to look at yourself and think, actually, is this the best environment for me? And that's where it starts. It starts with you, doesn't it, as an individual, in terms of whether you're getting things out of it that you want to. I know that you know, so, sort of simplifying, you know, if I was looking to lose weight and I worked in McDonald's, there's a challenge there potentially. Yeah. With my interest, my own interest in actually what I'm doing, or I worked in a sweet shop or whatever. Sure. And so I think you do need to look at that and actually figure out, is this the culture that I want to be in? Is this serving me? Is this benefiting me? Is this enhancing me? Yeah. And that's really where you start, because sometimes it's you're not able to change that culture if there isn't an appetite to change the culture. Yeah. You know, if you're one of 1,000 and you're the only one who's feeling like that, I'm not saying that's the case. Other people are feeling like it. Obviously, there will be, but I do think you need to start with yourself, really, and understand what you do want, and if you can adapt and bridge the gap between what you want and how you get that from where you are, then great. But you know, what you've described is a kind of a complete polar opposite, almost, of a really harsh environment that demands and manipulates. It is like, you know, a case study for bad practice versus someone who's actually. Well,
can I just question that? It's like, but these organizations don't think it's bad practice. They think it's good. They think it's good practice. Yeah. Otherwise, if they thought it was bad practice, they'd change it.
But it gets results, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So they think it's good practice.
Yeah.
So what is it that I suppose what that gives is two perspectives, doesn't it? It's like there's a perspective where that style of leadership and management can be perceived as good. And there's the other side of the coin, which is, well, actually, it's perceived as bad. And I think the driving force is, and this is going to sound like, for a lot of people, okay, this guy is like a real woo-woo, out of touch business person. Because what I'm going to say is the driving force for that is money.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. It's like, so these harsh environments, their total focus is money. The people they have are there for one purpose and only, and that is to serve the making of money. But there are organizations out there where they don't think that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just about finding the right home for you.
Yeah.
Being open about that. It's like, you know, I train every day. I'm very disciplined. I set up a home gym. Not everyone can do that.
No.
Some people prefer to go to the gym because they prefer to be in a social environment. Some people prefer to have a personal trainer because they need a kick in the backside every time they you know, they need something to compete against almost, or something to push them.
Yeah.
So if you're open and you know what you respond to, then that is half the battle in terms of finding the right home. You know, because when you join an organisation, it should feel like you're coming home, really. And of course, those highly pressured environments might work for some people.
Yeah.
You know, who need that, because otherwise they struggle with their own motivation, or and that keeps them going.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so I do think it's a case of starting with actually what does good look like for you? What are you, you know, what gets the best out of you?
Yeah. Yeah.
As an individual, and is that at odds with what you're doing, or is it aligned with what you're doing?
Yeah.
And where you are.
And what would you say for somebody who says not working in a big corporate culture, maybe working in a smaller business, maybe the business owner, right? So the business has been going along, it's been doing quite well for some time, but actually it's perhaps it's peaked, and they've started to perhaps go over the top. They can sense it as the business leader. You know, they're not seeing new business come in at the rate it was. They're starting to lose clients. A bit like the example you get, you know, that lifelong client who left, you know. So they can sense things aren't going, their confidence is starting to go. How should someone like that start to recognize when it is their confidence that's going, and what should they do about that?
So it's different for everyone, isn't it? You've got to understand really what the root cause is, where that's coming from. That's the starting point, I think, is understand where that's coming from. And really, you know, again, it starts with you. It starts with looking in the mirror and understanding and being honest with yourself about where things are coming from, what the real challenges are, diagnosing them. You know, you can use 5 whys as a really basic way of doing that, you know.
Sure.
And starting with what, you know, how you're feeling, and just working backwards in terms of understanding why, and keep asking it until you get to a, you know, bottom level of answer. But I think, you know, it's different. It's difficult because it needs some sort of diagnosis. And the challenge with that is people aren't, you know, they're thinking it's something else a lot of the time. They're thinking it's, you know, it's bad run of luck or whatever it might be, or they think it's their team, or they you know, they're looking for to assign blame. You know, they'll adopt a victim mindset. And they won't look inwardly at what's going on with their own, you know, confidence level. Self-belief. And so, you know, you've got to start with diagnosis, because if you're, you know, otherwise you're just dealing with symptoms. And you know, and that's never going to serve you. It might get you through a period, or, you know, weather a storm, but you know, you're always going to be susceptible to when that storm strikes again. So you've got to really get under the skin of it and understand what's going on, and look at yourself holistically as well. Don't look at it in terms, because it might not be in business that it's affected you. It might have come from somewhere else in your life, and it's trickled into business. And that can happen quite a lot. So I think you've got to start with looking at yourself and understanding what's going on, where are the feelings coming from, really coming from.
Which of course is why a lot of people don't do this, because
it's hard.
Actually, that's hard. It's scary to do that, and you know, I know it's because I had to do that. But it's, I mean, look, we were talking the other day about this thing called the dark night of the soul. And that's that point where you've reached your lowest point, you know, for whatever reason, and you've got nowhere else to go. And so this is what a lot of people wait for. It's like they put up with however bad things are. They put up with the feelings of inadequacy. They put up with the feeling of being an imposter. They hide it. They try and overcome it with compensating behaviors until they have no other place but they have to confront it. And that is the dark night of the soul, when you have to confront your whatever you want to call it, weaknesses, inadequacies, failings, those vulnerabilities that make you human. And so I think this is really what goes back to that point. Until you're willing to bring those vulnerabilities out in the open, they will drive the direction that you're going to go
Yeah.
until you have nowhere else to go, and
Yeah.
that is the dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
And that's the point where the phrase I love, I know you've heard me say this before, is people don't change until the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change.
Yeah.
Which is another way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Can't go on like this anymore.
Absolutely.
So I would say absolutely concur with what you're saying. It's like you've got to get to that point where you're willing to look inward. And this isn't like new stuff. This goes back thousands of years.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's the temple at Delphi, which is like however 3,000-4,000 years old. And I think it's the inscription in ancient Greek which says, "Know thyself."
Yeah.
So this is not new wisdom. This is very, very old wisdom.
Yeah.
With just obviously with psychology and neuroscience and all the stuff that we've now got, and emotional intelligence. We wrap it up in all sorts of scientific terminology, but this is very, very basic, fundamental, old stuff, and we all have to come to terms with it at some point. But I think that sort of wraps it up. So
I think just one thing to add to that actually is when you're doing that, if you are brave enough to do it, something that I've learned more recently actually is to let go of any attachment of answers you think you might have.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, that's deep.
And just actually look inwardly and be open to whatever the cause might be.
Yeah.
And explore it. Don't because you can actually work your way to an answer that satisfies your ego or
sure
it might be, and so that don't be a spin doctor about it. Actually do it for real, and let go of any attachment to preconceived ideas or answers that you think it is. Just be open.
Well, look,
get more out of it.
Yeah, and I've got to endorse that 100% because I've been through that process and I've done exactly that. I know you've done the same thing. So yeah, I love that, and I think that's a great way to bring this to a close.